Hello, everyone. Greetings from Santa Fe, New Mexico. My name is Mike White. For those who don't know me, I'm an ecologist. I worked for 20 years in San Diego County and other parts of California before taking the Conservation Science Director position for the Town Ranch Conservancy, where I got to work on conservation management on the largest working cattle ranch in California. I'm going to talk some more about that work today. But first, I'd want to remind us that the rangelands that we're talking about today are grasslands, oak savannas, and woodlands, evolved with large herds of grazing animals. In the southern San Joaquin Valley, where I was working at Tajon Ranch, there were prehistorically large herds of pronghorn, tule elk, and those animals are now completely gone from the landscape. Likewise, our flora has been invaded. I get to Tajon Ranch, I'm looking at the amazing intact landscape that I get to work in, and ultimately realize that if it's not a tree or a shrub, most of what I'm looking at is largely non-native species. Invasive annual Mediterranean grasses and broadleaf forbs have really completely altered the landscapes that we're working in today. But I want to make one point that not all of these species function on the landscape the same way. So just a quick example with wild oat on the left and fillory on the right. Wild oats can form these very dense patches of grasslands in some years, and this is just frankly not good habitat for much of anything. A lot of this biomass remains on the ground for quite a long time, has adverse effects. It's fuel, changes fire regimes. Carla D'Antonio at UC Santa Barbara has characterized these Mediterranean grasses as transformer species because they completely alter ecosystem functions. The picture on the right is a forb-dominated site. The two guys out there are noosing blunt-nosed leopard lizards. I'll talk a bit more about that species in a minute, but these forb-dominated sites just never achieved the same stature or level of biomass that the grass-dominated sites do, and thus have really very different ecosystem functions. We need to keep that in mind in our management efforts. And so in light of the fact that our grasslands have been really very transformed by invasive plants and animals, some colleagues and I looked at how cattle grazing can actually be used to maintain biodiversity in these transformed grasslands. So I just want to share a few examples from that work. There are special status amphibians, largely up in Central California, tiger salamander and red-legged frog, that really are increasingly relying on livestock ponds across the landscape to breed in. Tiger salamander also uses small mammal and ground squirrel burrows to estivate in during the winter, and small mammals and ground squirrels tend to do better in grazed landscapes than ungrazed landscapes. Grassland birds have been shown to prefer or to do better in grazed grasslands than ungrazed grasslands, and likewise we often find raptors utilizing grazed grasslands, and that may be because of, again, enhancement of their prey populations. Wetlands, Jamie Marty has shown that vernal pools functions of vernal pools can be enhanced in the presence of livestock, such as the hydro period, extending the hydro period of pools when livestock are present. And in spring-fed wetlands, Randy Jackson and Barbara Allen Diaz actually showed that native biodiversity can actually be enhanced with moderate grazing as opposed to lack of livestock. And there are even some invertebrate species that seem to benefit from the presence of cattle. The rare Ohlone tiger beetle, which occurs in coastal prairies of Santa Cruz County, does better in grazed prairie than in ungrazed prairie. And our native wildflowers. Germination of wildflowers is actually depressed by accumulations of thatch from annual grasses. This is a shot of Tajon Ranch, actually. And in this particular grassland habitat, these other rare vertebrates occur. Blunt-nosed leopard lizard and San Joaquin kit fox are endangered species, and the burrowing owl also tend to use these lower biomass grasslands where thatch is not accumulating over time. And so just to finish up on some of the context, we've seen our grasslands and rangelands have been transformed by non-native plants, loss of our prehistoric grazing regimes, land uses around these areas have changed, bioregimes and climates are changing, but there are still important native legacies in these rangelands. And in particular, there are ecological functions that are valuable for maintaining certain elements of biodiversity. It's important that we identify where these remaining pieces of biodiversity and intact ecological functions still exist. There's also an administrative or a regulatory context to conservation management. At Tejon, we had the Tejon Conservation and Land Use Agreement, which established the framework within which we got to do our planning and implement the management. In San Diego County, you've got the Multi-Species Conservation Program that also establishes a framework for how conservation management is implemented over time. But in other settings, it's different. And so all the context matters, the setting matters in how you proceed. And then we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but the social and economic context is also important. And just suffice it to say that the factors that drive decision-making for the various players in some of these endeavors does not always align. And so I would say it's advantageous for us to look for opportunities and ways to try to make everybody whole in these efforts. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Tejon Ranch Agreement. So the Tejon Ranch Conservation and Land Use Agreement was actually a private land use agreement between the Tejon Ranch Company. This is Bob Stein, the CEO of the company, and these 5 environmental organizations. These are representatives of those organizations at the press conference announcing the deal with Governor Schwarzenegger. So this is Tejon Ranch, 270,000 acres. It's the largest contiguous private property in California. Under the agreement, 240,000 acres of that is conserved. The 5 areas shown down in the lower right, these are areas the Conservancy had to raise money to purchase conservation easements for, and then the rest of the ranch was going to be dedicated by the ranch company. So conservation again is via easement, and under those easements, development and mining rights are extinguished, but importantly, the ranch retains the right to graze livestock in the easement areas. And so given the large amount of rangelands on Tejon and the fact that this was a reserved right of the landowner, getting our arms around rangeland functions and how to think about managing those to enhance conservation values was a priority for the Conservancy. And the outcome of the management planning effort was the ranchland management plan that lays out sort of the background or thinking about the ecology of the ranch, assumptions, hypotheses, and then ultimately the on-the-ground activities that we were proposing to undertake. So a little bit about the planning process itself. I think it's important to consider the mission or perhaps the charter of the program, if you will. The mission of the Tejon Ranch Conservancy is there at the top of the slide. I've underlined just to emphasize here, but the mission is really to preserve, enhance, and restore native biodiversity and ecosystem values. It's not about conserving ranching heritage or cultural resources. It's about native biodiversity and ecosystem values, with the understanding that the landowner has certain reserve rights that have to be respected. And so the Conservancy was charged with preparing a science-based adaptive management plan. Adaptive management is when we treat management as an experiment. So we hypothesize about the way the system and management actions will work. We implement management actions and collect monitoring data that we can use to feed back in and reevaluate our hypotheses and our thinking about the system and adjust management as necessary. And there were really two outcomes of the plan for the Conservancy. There were conservation activities. These are the on-the-ground activities that the Tejon Ranch Conservancy will implement to enhance conservation values. And then there are best management practices. These were activities that the ranch company and their lessees, in the case of cattle grazing, were going to implement to enhance conservation values. So it's also important to set goals and objectives. So almost all conservation management programs have a goal and objectives section. It may be called different things, use different terminology, but essentially goals are these broad, general, aspirational statements of what we're trying to achieve. And then objectives are more explicit statements of what that means. What are the desired outcomes that we want to see? And then in the case of the Conservancy, the on-the-ground or the tactical measures to achieve goals and objectives are conservation activities, again, implemented by the Conservancy, and best management practices implemented by the landowner. And so just an example for the San Joaquin Valley Grasslands, the bolded statement at the top is the goals, and I pulled out 3 objectives to show. So the goal for the San Joaquin Valley Grassland was to maintain and enhance habitat quality and function of grassland ecosystems and native plant and animal species that characterize them. So we knew that we had these special status vertebrates, the San Joaquin kit fox and blunt-nosed leopard lizard, and that we needed to do something to try to benefit those target species. But then there was some uncertainty about what those historic native communities actually looked like in the southern San Joaquin Valley, because so many changes had occurred before anybody really started looking at it in detail. And so we wanted to go in and do our best to characterize what that historic biodiversity looked like, and then try to think about where it would make sense to restore it on the ranch. And this is just a shot of what that, in the grasslands, what that native biodiversity can look like. And so this was my first spring at the ranch in a San Joaquin Valley pasture. This is a little bit outside of Arvin in the Southern Valley there. And it's just amazing. It's not super diverse, but there's a lot of native species in here. And so this is what we're out to manage and try to enhance. So this is actually the same field, just looking at a different direction, but I want to use this slide to talk about ecological sites for a minute. So ecological sites are units of the landscape that have similar physical and chemical properties. So soil texture and chemistry, aspects, slopes, elevation, certainly climate. And the idea is that these units of the landscape, these distinct ecological sites, support unique vegetation communities and are expected to respond similarly to management. And so it's a good framework. It's being promoted by the NRCS and others to think about rangeland management. And so if we look at this slide, what we can see here are these different landforms. So this is actually ancient landslide debris that's coming in here on the right. You can see this granitic basement rock peeking up through these steeper slopes. There's actually some mafic rock outcrops over in this area, and all of this draining down into this big alluvial fan. And so these are all probably distinct ecological sites. And we had the benefit of having some very good, strong baseline research done by Sherry Spiegel under the supervision of Jamie Bartolome. Sherry's now at the Jornada, but her research really established the foundation for how we thought about managing the grasslands at the time. And so this is a schematic showing some of the results of Sherry's work. She found 6 ecological sites on the San Joaquin Valley, but not all of those sites were distinct from one another with respect to the vegetation that they supported, and we found that really one of those sites had the kind of native biodiversity that we thought was worth trying to go in and sort of focus our management on, and that we could see from her research that there was a lot of value in this area, and this was a place where we thought we could get a lot of return on our investment to focus attention. So in our management plan, we really focused a lot of management attention on these Holocene Flats ecological sites. Just show you sort of what it looks like. This is actually the mouth of Tahone Canyon, showing what David Magny, a botanist that we hired back in 2009, characterized as the Tahone Milky Way, because it's just like a couple of thousand acres of popcorn flower in some years. And so you can see in this slide the temporal variability as well. And so it was really important, again, the research results that we had were really important for us to understand how these grasslands varied in space and time, and it would have been difficult to see that without that research. The other thing it allowed us to do was to think about where on the landscape we needed to prioritize our management. And so this is a slide showing a map of Tahone. The ranch is outlined in black. The yellow lines are fences forming pastures for livestock, and what I've done is highlight in red the pastures that support the Holocene Flats ecological site. So it's not the whole ranch, it's a very discrete part of the ranch. And in this part of the ranch, the conservation management outcome that we really were looking for to enhance our resources was just low biomass. So we did not want a lot of annual grass thatch building up, and we wanted the ranchers to work with us to graze those pastures to keep the biomass low. And what the ranchers said is, the problem that we have in holding cattle too long is there's just not a lot of water there. So the conservation activity that ends up being implemented to achieve our objective here is to add livestock water so that the cattlemen can keep their animals in these pastures for a longer period of time. So the Conservancy raised money and got NRCS cost share dollars to install new waters in some of these pastures supporting Holocene Flats as a conservation activity, with the understanding that the ranchers would then implement a best management practice, which was to keep the biomass low. And so this was really, just wanted to share with you the thought process that we went through in doing conservation management here. The Conservancy is now monitoring these sites and will, adjust their management as necessary in the future. The one other point that I'd like to make, though, before we conclude here is that we had an opportunity to spend some time at the beginning of our management planning with the ranchers and representatives from the landowner. And this was a really important endeavor for us because the ranchers and obviously the landowner had been there much longer than we had. They had ideas about new infrastructure and how their management might be changed to accommodate things. We had our ideas, and it was an opportunity for really to get on the same page with things. And I would just say this is one of the most valuable things that we did leading into our management, in addition to having some great baseline research. So I want to summarize. We've shown elsewhere that in our modified rangeland habitats in California that livestock can be successfully used to achieve conservation objectives. I'll also say that management efforts really need to be prioritized, and that's largely based on the mission of your organization, your goals, but I say it's important to have realistic goals. We had a board member at Tahone whose goal was to remove every non-native species on the ranch and put it back to the way it was before Columbus got here. That's just not realistic. And I think if there's one tenet of conservation management, it's resources are always going to be limiting. And so you have to prioritize where you're going to work in order to achieve the strongest outcomes that you can. Again, for us, having a data-driven, science-based foundation to our work was really key in just how we thought about the place and allowing us to formulate management hypotheses and to prioritize where we were going to work. And then we didn't talk much about it, but adaptive management is not an easy thing to do, but it's really the way that these programs need to be conducted. And so I think it's important to try to think about how you develop a framework that provides the flexibility to allow adaptive management to work. Adaptive management being an experiment, things are going to fail sometimes. And so we have to be able to accept that failure and to learn from it and to move on. And so I just want to say thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion in a little bit.